We're into the very last week, week 12 of political philosophy. And I've entitled this, Choosing How to Live Well and Die Well, Faced with Ecosystem Collapse. Since this is the very last week, I'd like to begin with an overview of our objectives and show you how we achieve them. I'd then like to look at the material for this week, Political Philosophy for a Future. We'll begin, as we do in each week, in each module, looking at the historical problem and the divisive conflicts that we need to respond to. We'll then turn to how liberal approaches might assist and problems with these approaches. I will provide you with my own creative reflection based on this week's reading at this point, so that you have a clear idea or a clearer idea of what my expectations are for that assignment. As we do each week, we don't just look at the historical problem of divisive conflict and the response of liberal political philosophers and their critics. We also consider critical reflections, critical considerations. In some cases, this involves critics of the liberal approaches, and we've had a look at those critics, the work of those critics in each week. But I also want to make the broader point in closing that no particular argument, use of public reason is ever devoid of its own exclusions. It may be that some exclusions are better than others, but that is still an argument to be made. And so in the critical considerations part of this lecture, I try and build those into my own creative reflection. And finally, I end with a closing statement. So, to provide an overview of our objectives so that we can then consider how we achieve them, one objective was to locate the renewal of political philosophy in an effort to respond to divisive conflicts visible in the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. We saw how US political philosophers really did try to use public reasons to avoid the paralysis that their British counterparts had experienced, given the effect of logical positivism on the confidence of British philosophers to make moral and political judgments. So we located the renewal of political philosophy in the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And then we turned to how liberal political philosophers actually responded to those conflicts visible in the social movements. We studied how liberal political philosophers propose we think through these conflicts and the implications for our public institutions. And as we did every week, we looked at critics and criticisms of these liberal approaches, moving beyond liberal approaches to consider how liberal political philosophers prioritised only certain aspects of the problem, overlooking others, and in some cases deepening existing injustices, requiring new frameworks, new efforts to articulate public reasons acceptable to others. Today, another objective was to consider our problems of today, beyond the context of the 1960s and 1970s. Our task was to consider how we might think through today's problems using ideas like public reason, while also retaining as much as possible attention to potential exclusions to learn from this history. So let's now look at how we achieved these by providing an overview of the subject as a whole. We began with a first social movement, the civil rights movement. looking at the historical context of struggle to secure civil rights, both equal liberties and economic justice for African Americans against segregation and racial oppression. We looked at how liberal theories of civil disobedience became formulated in this context in response to this struggle. We saw how Martin Luther King elaborated religious arguments to ground a claim that all persons are made in God's image, deserving of equality, with civil disobedience to be understood as the conscientious breaking of law that displays respect for a higher law of justice. And we saw how John Rawls provided a liberal defence of civil disobedience. A liberal defence, as long as civil disobedience was targeted towards achieving the objective of equal rights and liberties, and as long as the act itself was public, non-violent, conscientious, and the disobedient person accepted legal penalty. We saw how John Rawls accepted Martin Luther King Jr.'s reliance on religious reasons, as long as those religious reasons could, in principle, be eventually formulated as public reasons, and John Rawls thought that they could. We then looked at critics of this early liberal approach, and we noted some of the differences between Rawls and Martin Luther King Jr., who wanted more than mere equal basic rights and liberties, but also economic justice. Moving beyond liberal theories, we saw how deliberative Democrats criticised Rawls's restriction of objectives to mere rights and liberties, and how radical theorists criticised Rawls's circumscription of methods. After considering civil disobedience to support civil rights, we then considered a second social movement, anti-war, the anti-war movement, also of the 1960s and 70s. The historical context was US involvement in the Vietnam War. We looked at influential liberal theories of just and unjust war that emerged in this context and in response to deeply held convictions that US involvement in Vietnam was wrong. We looked at the liberal political philosopher Michael Walzer, who, although also informed by humanitarian ideas of justice, certainly developed a liberal framework for thinking through just and unjust war. Michael Walzer's account of just and unjust war is that the first aggression is always unjust, and the aggressed always have a right to defence. But Walzer also provided an account of rights and obligations of armies and soldiers in war. He defended the idea of non-combatant immunity. He felt that we should see that non-combatants who were not involved in fighting the war should not be killed. Intentionally killing non-combatants is impermissible. Only combatants can be targeted, he argued. He also argued for the principle of proportionality. The unintentional killing of non-combatants is permissible, he argued, since it's often impossible to achieve objectives without it. But he felt that we should recognise that it's only permissible if proportionate to the goals that the attack is intended to achieve. If the killing of innocents is not proportional to the objective, then it needs to be condemned. Walzer also argued for the principle of combatant equality. He argued that when fighting, combatants can be killed without restraint, but an enemy soldier fighting for the aggressor is not themselves to be blamed as an individual. Now, this means for Walzer a right to surrender, also a right to escape if captured, but also a duty not to kill if trying to escape. He felt that other rights and duties could be derived in particular context given the above principles of non-combatant immunity, proportionality and combatant equality. We moved beyond this liberal communitarian theory of just war to consider some criticisms. We asked, is it possible to justly commence a war, say, to avert tragedies or secure humanitarian ends? If so, are there contexts and situations in which it should be viewed as wrong for unjust combatants to kill just combatants? Is this a distinction that we need to retain? Walser doesn't. Also, we asked, looking beyond liberal theories, how does one ever assess the relation between the value of a military objective and how many innocent lives might be shed to achieve it? This is a question about how to achieve this proportionality principle. We also saw some criticisms had been made by Seth Lazar and others as to whether non-combatants can really be viewed as immune from blame if they contribute through their actions to funding an army or funding the science and technology of military aggression. And we also considered the criticism brought to Walser's theory about how a first aggression should be understood, noting that the idea of a first aggression needs greater clarity. It needs to be defined with respect to a broader history. So these are the theories and ideas and criticisms that we considered when studying the response to US involvement in the Vietnam War. We then turned to a third social movement, the anti-conscription movements, the rejection of the draft in protest and agitation. The historical context was conscientious objection to the use of the draft in the Vietnam War. This was quite obviously linked to the anti-war movement, because in some cases conscientious objection was articulated by reference to a claim that the war itself was unjust. Interestingly, we saw that it was also linked for many, like Muhammad Ali, for example, with the civil rights movement. Vietnam and US involvement in Vietnam was, for Ali, another example of the oppression of non-white people linked to the civil rights movement. We then looked at how liberal theorists conceptualized conscientious objection and justified conscientious objection while rejecting pacifism. For John Rawls, we saw that not all non-public reasons can be accepted in a political liberal society. Human sacrifice surely wouldn't. But he still felt that there were cases when conscientious objection to war based on non-public religious reasons should be accepted. He did not go very far in this analysis, though, and lots of questions were left unanswered. So we turned to Joseph Raz, who argued that, a rather odd argument, that the only way to base a right to conscientious objection on moral principles was to concede that because somebody wrongly believes that military service is morally prohibited for them, they should be allowed to opt out. So Raz's arguments in favour of accepting conscientious objection really relied on first showing that one really did have a moral obligation to take part in a state's war once that had been committed to, but that if somebody really and truly with conviction believed that military service was morally prohibited, even though that view was wrong, they should still be allowed to opt out. Raz thus argued that law must recognise the right not to have one's conscience coerced. And law should also try to prevent problems that can arise from permitting conscientious objection. And we looked at some of those problems in terms of how to still secure military, how to ensure the perception of fairness to those forced to fight, and what to do with conscientious objectors. That their service should be equivalent to their military service in some way. So they should be asked to serve in a medical occupation rather than on the front line, things like that. We then looked at some of the problems with liberal theories of pacifism. Rawls and other liberal thinkers have ruled pacifism as inconsistent with political liberalism. Pacifism shouldn't be accepted as a reason for conscientious objection, because people should recognise that they have a duty to defend their state when attacked or when that state is committed to war. But many, including many of you in class, had good reasons to propose against this Rawlsian and liberal view. Some of you argued this point in your essays. The other critical point was about whether pacifist moral comprehensive doctrines should be accepted as equivalent to religious conviction. Why shouldn't it be equivalent? Why should one prioritise the duty to defend one's state over other moral duties that seem equally as deeply held as a religious conviction? We then turn to a fourth social movement. Such unrest, so much political and social change happening during this period. We looked at the women's and sexual liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s. Although we began with a note to explain how we would refer to gender, advocating for the use of language that reflects plural and diverse gender identification. We continued to use the categories of woman and man as they were used by theorists and activists during this time period of the 1960s and 1970s. Looking at the historical context, we studied the demand for women's rights and outcomes equivalent to men's, demand for liberation in sexual relations beyond the confines of reproduction in families. And so after briefly considering how John Rawls writes about the family in A Theory of Justice, we turned to Susan Moller-Ocken and her liberal feminist criticisms of Rawls. She criticised Rawls' account of the family as a space and kind of neutral private space for moral training. Ocken felt we should accept that two principles should apply to families too. The first is that men and women should enjoy institutions that allow them to equally share public and domestic responsibilities, paid and unpaid responsibilities of family life. And the second principle was that protections for those who choose to undertake the bulk of unpaid family work should be instituted so that those who do choose to undertake unpaid work are protected from the vulnerabilities that they would otherwise incur. In subsequent weeks, though, we studied criticisms of theories like Susan Moller Ockham's liberal feminist theories. We looked first to the work of bell hooks, who argued that these are principles that mostly seek to respond to white mothers' claims of injustice. And non-white women had very different concerns, bell hooks argued. They were concerned with ensuring that motherhood could be non-compulsory. They also wanted conditions for effective parenting, not for being able to have a profession alongside motherhood, but really conditions to allow parents to be effective, shorter working hours, better pay, security of income. Bell hooks also argued that non-white women wanted social structures that supported single parents and also things like non-racist childcare. Beyond criticisms on racial injustice grounds of Susan Moller Ockham's liberal feminist criticisms of John Rawls, we then turned to gender and queer criticisms, looking at the work of Kathy Weeks. We asked, well, what about inequalities in rights and outcomes experienced by non-traditional families or persons of diverse or non-conforming gender? And we studied how liberal feminist theories had not dealt with this form of injustice. And then we turned to a fifth social movement around access to abortion and contraception. We saw how birth control movements around reproductive rights and reproductive justice also emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. So the historical context was both a new pro-life, pro-choice framing of abortion, access to abortion, and also a poverty alleviation framing of this issue, where birth control, including contraception access and access to abortion services, were increasingly viewed as poverty alleviating technologies. We saw that the war on poverty as part of the Great Society had seen birth control for the very first time as poverty alleviating, as an important component of achieving civil rights as well. When we turn to look at how liberal theorists of reproductive rights had analysed these debates, we saw how Judith Jarvis Thomson really focused only on the pro-life, pro-choice framing. And she argued that although it would be morally desirable to assist another's life, this should be viewed as supererogatory and not as morally obligatory in most cases. She felt the duties to the self, to chosen others, and to existing children should take priority. But we did notice that this really was an argument that made sense, or really that allowed itself to be framed with the new pro-life, pro-choice framing. And it didn't really deal with the poverty alleviation framing that was also a feature of the debates around birth control during the 1960s and 1970s. We saw how John Rawls chose to focus on political obligations, political rights, rather than the moral arguments. He claimed, in a nutshell, if I were to try to paraphrase his views, that in cases of unreconcilable conflict between competing moral comprehensive doctrines about whose life matters more, a political right to abortion should have priority. We then moved, as we did each week, beyond liberal theories to look at Erica Miller's claim that really the focus on this issue through the lens of pro-life, pro-choice framing is a relatively recent construct, and we need not feel this way. We didn't used to feel this way, and we shouldn't necessarily feel this way about we shouldn't feel guilt, shame, sadness, and so forth when accessing abortion services. We also, and some of you had, and we had a good discussion around that issue in the context of its different focus, a very different focus to Judith Jarvis Thompson's arguments. We saw how Erica Miller's approach drew strongly on a new reproductive justice framing, where we really should be concerned with more than rights to life or rights to choice, but also the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, the right to safely parent a child, and beyond that too, the right to safely not have a child, which is potentially implied by the right not to have a child. So we saw that reproductive justice requires more than simply thinking through the issue of access to abortion services through a pro-life, pro-choice framework. It requires a whole range of considerations linked with the ability to provide, safely parent, and the like. And then last week we turned to a sixth social movement. We looked at environmentalism of the 1960s and 1970s, which really did emerge as a force during this period. We saw that the 1960s and 1970s saw growing environmental activism with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the impact of the appreciation of the vulnerability and precarity of our existence with Earthrise, Earth photographed in its vulnerability from the moon. But we found ourselves struggling here, because when we tried to locate liberal political philosophers who had tackled the problems featured by the environmental activists of the 1960s and 1970s, we couldn't find any, to the best of my knowledge. And I could be wrong, this is a new subject that I'm teaching. To the best of my knowledge, there are no liberal political philosophies of environmental justice during this era. There may be in other areas that do not count so easily as liberal, but I could not find distinctly liberal political philosophers who dealt with the problem of environmentalism, climate justice and the like during the 1960s and 1970s. Certainly there are now liberal theories of environmental justice using a liberal framework to develop public reasons for action of particular sorts on climate change and a consideration of the rights and responsibilities and obligations that accrue to whom, how much, etc., but not from the 1960s and 1970s. I presented this as odd, but perhaps not surprising in the context of what Amitav Ghosh has described in literature as a great derangement. Perhaps something similar applied to political philosophy of this era. As for moving beyond liberal theories, well, that's the topic for this week. And that really is, in a nutshell, is a summary of what we've achieved and in this subject so far, and how we've really tried to achieve those objectives that we set ourselves of illuminating how political philosophy became formulated in response to the social movements, how liberal political philosophers provided new ways of thinking through these issues using public reason, and how this led to criticisms and evolving debate around how to respond. So let's turn to the material for this week, Political Philosophy for a Future. And we're looking today at a required reading by Donna Haraway, The Children of Compost. And it's very different to the sorts of readings that we've been exposed to in this subject so far. It's a work of fiction, but also philosophy, in the sense that it does deal with a problem, it does present a problem, and it does explore how Haraway thinks we could respond to this problem, living well and dying well on a damaged planet. But it's very different. The text is not argumentative per se. It's a story. The reasons and views are not presented as public reasons that should be accepted by all, but more as an imagination of a possible world that we might want to work towards. And so this raises a larger question of the role and scope for imagination in thinking about our world. What role does imagination play in constructing the sorts of worlds in idea form that we would like to live in, so that we can then work towards them as a condition for working towards them? This is not a practical or realistic utopia, as Rawls asks us to conceptualize the role of political philosophy. One of the 4 roles of political philosophy was that it help us identify and work towards practical, realistic utopias. And so it's a very different approach to the problem at hand. And I've chosen to end on this because we've looked primarily at liberal political philosophy in this subject. We've looked at how arguments have been presented by liberal political philosophers who have mobilized this idea of public reason, that we need to develop and propose reasons that we think should be accepted by reasonable persons once they take a position like the original position behind a veil of ignorance. We've also explored in this course criticisms of this idea of public reason and the reasons that are put forward as, in principle, acceptable to others. And so I wanted to end on a more open-ended note. I wanted to encourage you to consider whether or not imagining a world that is impractical, that seems unable to be realised at the moment, but that seems to give us ideas for ourselves and for our political, legal, institutional structures, whether thinking through problems and responses using imagination to explore the sorts of worlds that we want to create might also have a valuable role in political philosophy. And that's to do political philosophy very differently. So Donna Haraway calls herself an eco-feminist writer, philosopher, and thinker. And so it's with her work that I'd like to close this subject with a more open-ended overture to new ways of thinking beyond liberal accounts. So let's turn to the historical problem and the divisive conflict, as Donna Haraway conceptualised it, how to live well and die well on an irreversibly damaged planet. And let's look at her response. But I'll do that this week by providing my own answers to your assignment questions, the creative reflection. I'll try to present first what a liberal like Rules might say of Donna Haraway's account of the problem and of her imagined utopian world. How consistent is this way of thinking with a liberal approach? And then I'll consider criticisms of liberal approaches. And then I'll present my views on what should be done and whether or not Donna Haraway's and Rawls's quite different approaches are convincing to me. What do I think might need to be done, and am I convinced or satisfied by their own answers? So then this will also allow you to get a sense of how to do the creative reflection and what I'm expecting. And you'll see that this task is, again, more open-ended. It's not an essay. It's not a short paper. You don't need to display the sorts of academic skills that I've asked you to display in your previous assignments. So you'll get a sense of what I'm expecting through me presenting my own answer. So this is a creative reflection on Donna Haraway's The Khmer Stories, Children of Compost, in her book Staying with the Trouble, making kin in the Chthulhucene. So your creative reflection asks you to begin by selecting a resource, by a resource that helps you illustrate a particular problem and its urgency. You need to explain what the position is in the resource. You also need to consider how the nature of the resource, mere opinion, argument, public interest reporting, creative work, etc., affects how you make use of it. And the aim is to both present the resource and the way it conceptualizes the problem and the reasons for the urgency of this problem. So this is to try to help you to think like a political philosopher today about problems that you think are urgent to face, that we need to face today. So this is my answer. So I have chosen a resource about the problem of how to live well and die well on a damaged planet. Its urgency. This is an urgent problem today because many scientists now fear that it is no longer realistic to expect stability in the ecosystems that have thus far supported human lives. And I provided a reference to the IPCC report of 2022. The resource is a chapter called The Children of Compost by Donna Haraway, an eco-feminist sci-fi writer and philosopher from the US. And so now I turn, and I'll also provide a reference to that as on the previous slide. So now I turn to explaining the problem and the solution. So, I've already done the problem. This is the position of the resource. So I now turn to the position. It tells the story of how a community of people face this problem of how to live well and die well on a damaged planet across 5 subsequent generations. These imagined lives include voluntarily chosen new social arrangements. For example, to reduce population while still allowing the chance to have children. One child in this community has at least 3 parents, each of whom contribute genetic material. They may not always contribute genetic material, but they can. They can work out how they want to have these children. Children can also choose to cultivate genetic symbioses with migrating critters like the monarch butterfly to help them emotively feel their dependencies on the environment. Communities can also choose to adopt damaged mountains. People in these communities devote their lives to caring for each other and for their damaged ecosystems. This is an account of a real problem, and an urgent one: how to live well and die well on a planet where it's no longer realistic to expect stability in the ecosystems that have supported life, as I explained earlier. And it's also a fictional imagination of one way we might respond. As such, it can loosely be considered as a type of political philosophy, in that it presents a case for how we should organise our lives in response to an urgent problem. And that's my account of how the nature of the resource affects how I've chosen to deal with it. I'm dealing with it as a type of political philosophy, even though it's fictional. It establishes a problem and presents a way of responding to that problem, where we're asked to consider whether it resonates with ways in which we might find appealing for organising our lives. But it's loosely philosophical in the sense that it's no longer depicted as this world is no longer presented with public reasons that are meant to persuade other reasonable persons to accept them. It's a different way of operating. So you get a sense now of how you might use the resource to explain the problem, its urgency, and how that resource allows you to establish that urgency and consider a response. The second question you're asked for your creative reflection is to think with and beyond liberal political philosophy, how institutions should be organised to respond to the problem. And you're asked to draw explicitly on at least one liberal political philosopher studied in this subject and explain what you think their method of reasoning or approach would allow them to say about your social and political problem. And in this case, Donna Haraway's imagined solution too. So what might a liberal like John Rawls say of Haraway's problem of how to live well and die well on a damaged planet? And what might Rawls say of Haraway's imagined world? First, although Rawls did not deal with the problem of ecosystem collapse, we saw that last week, didn't we? He would likely see Haraway's formulation of the problem as posed in moral terms rather than in political terms. Her problem seems to be less about what constitutes fair, mutually advantageous terms of cooperation, to be determined behind a veil of ignorance. Her problem is more about how individuals should lead their own lives. And Rawls would probably say that her response is a defence of a kind of moral comprehensive doctrine. I think she doesn't talk about, a political obligation to change laws to, make all communities behave in this way. It's more about opening up possibilities for people to choose this as a form of life for themselves, so moral comprehensive doctrines. Second, as such, Rawls would say that Haraway's imagined world cannot be imposed on other people, but must be freely chosen and consistent with the continued existence of other competing moral comprehensive doctrines. This is the liberal approach, right? You can't impose your moral comprehensive doctrine on anybody else, but you're very much free to choose to pursue it as long as there are protections of those people in those communities so that they can be free to leave and free from coercion within those communities. Haraway's communities in this way might very well be equivalent to religious communities on Rawls's view. Third, Rawls would not necessarily support legal changes that would permit the adoption by communities of damaged mountains, a liberal conception of justice. conceptualize people in the community as free and equal, but not mountains and not natural organisms. This is one aspect where Donna Haraway does implicitly defend political rights for new entities that have not yet received them. And there's some interesting work recently by legal scholars on whether or not nature should have rights. And in this sense, the imagined world would actually be beyond the moral comprehensive doctrine type of world, but one that requires supporting legal structures as well, political structures to permit that sort of living for those involved. But still, I think Rawls would see this as a moral comprehensive doctrine. And he certainly wouldn't support legal changes that would permit the adoption of communities by damaged mountains. A liberal conception of justice conceptualises people in the community as free and equal, but not mountains and not natural organisms. Fourth, Rawls would want to make sure that even in Haraway's imagined community, people would have freedom of choice about whether and how many children to have, and rights to care for those children. So a political liberal framework like Rawls's would certainly allow the sorts of communities that Haraway imagines. But it would be always important for Rawls to ensure that liberal freedoms were still upheld, both within those communities and without, beyond those communities. So Rawls would want to ensure that people can have children without the need for the sorts of community consent that Haraway imagines. Although even Haraway wants to say that even without community consent, people should be able to have children on their own terms. But she hopes that community consent will become an important way in which people spontaneously choose to limit their having of children. Rawls would be really concerned to say that community consent shouldn't be imposed on people, and they should be free to have or not have children as they please by leaving that community potentially. In sum, Rawls would likely explicitly say that Haraway does not really deal with the demands of public reason and political obligation, but only with how people might choose if they want to live well and die well. And this is entirely consistent with a political liberal conception in the sense that it doesn't try to impose necessarily change on others, but just hopes that people will pursue and live in this way for themselves. So that's how I think somebody like John Rawls might approach the way in which Donna Haraway has formulated her problem, living well and dying well on a planet whose ecosystems are now really damaged irreversibly beyond the possibility of stability, the stability that has previously sustained the organisms in that ecosystem. And now we're going to turn to problems with a liberal approach. So we deal first with liberal approach. How would a liberal approach that you studied make sense of this problem and the solution that Haraway has depicted? And now problems with that liberal approach. Draw explicitly on at least one critic of liberal approaches and explain how their concerns about liberal thinking might apply. What are some potential objections to a liberal approach to your social and political problem? Now, in the module on environmental social movements, we found that neither liberal political philosophers didn't really deal explicitly with this problem.
of environmental collapse and ecosystem collapse. And we didn't present the sorts of critics that we've presented in the other modules, which have reflected on problems with the liberal political philosophical approaches. But we can, in my view, view Donna Haraway as a kind of alternative conception to the liberal view, in the sense that she thinks that these solutions will involve people spontaneously choosing to live in these ways, and that we should be cultivating the imaginatory and cultural forces that allow us to view these as possible for us, realistic options. So here's my response. There are two problems that follow on from viewing Haraway's imagined world as a moral comprehensive conception compatible with other moral conceptions, as Rawls would see it. The first is the problem of whether these small imagined communities can in fact alleviate climate crisis and ecosystem collapse. It seems to some extent like a cop-out for the imagined solution to simply involve people going off-grid to look after each other and their environments, particularly when it would be very easy for other people to undermine those efforts. As a liberal thinker who draws on recognition theory has elsewhere argued, environmental health is an objective that requires a collective effort. So Fraser thinks that we need to supplement liberal approaches with a political commitment to a moral comprehensive doctrine of saving the earth, saving our ecosystems, keeping them healthy. And that requires a collective effort and a collective commitment to a moral comprehensive doctrine at the level of the political. So the second problem is that a liberal defence of a political society is really a defence of a society in which there is place both for the people in Haraway's imagined world and people who actively choose to undermine environmental health. This is an extension of the previous point. This suggests that one cannot hope to slow down or even undo economic devastation if political society allows moral comprehensive doctrines that actually create such destruction. In other words, a liberal approach compatible with Haraway's world, the one we explored on the previous slide, will actually enable the sort of devastation that Haraway hopes to slow if that liberal society does not actively contain those doctrines. However, this would mean communities imposing a moral comprehensive doctrine on others through laws and through the administration of justice to avoid environmental devastation. And this must inevitably involve a degree of necessary illiberalism. This is Nancy Fraser's point. She's a liberal political philosopher, but she thinks that there's a moment in time when we need to have even liberal political societies contained by an illiberal conception if we're ever going to resolve climate crisis. We cannot let moral comprehensive doctrines that do not coincide with the goal of ecosystem stability, we cannot let those survive in a political liberal society. And that's an illiberal element of liberalism. A third problem is that Rawls argues that political philosophy must establish practicable and realistic ideals. So the content of justice must be practicable and seen to be implemented, a realistic utopia. But he does not consider whether imagining a world that may currently seem unrealistic, in this case the world of Cammie's community, the Children of Compost, might actually be a first step to working to create it. This is where Haraway's imagined world might be useful. Imagining the worlds we want to create, even if they seem impractical today, seems to be a first step to creating them. So those are the problems with a liberal approach. And finally, your creative reflection asks you what you think should be done. Make your own case for what should be done and why. What sort of method of reasoning are you employing, and why do you think it is appropriate for your social and political problem? Here's my answer. My pessimistic view is that our ecosystems have become so damaged that stability and sustainability are impractical objectives. This being the case, we must both cultivate individual resilience, which is reliant on liberal freedoms, and a collective commitment to trying to care for critters in our world, as Haraway calls them, a moral comprehensive doctrine that must be imposed in illiberal ways on others who do not share it. The importance of Haraway's imagined world lies here. It encourages us to consider how we might still lead meaningful, significant, joyful, generous lives with people, critters, and the things that we love, even on a planet that is increasingly inhospitable to existing life forms. And it encourages us to work towards this by enforcing this with laws and the administration of justice, even if Haraway's imagined world does not explicitly include this coercive aspect. It will involve a coercive aspect, in my view. So we need to coercively and collectively commit to caring for our world. And that will require curtailing environmentally devastating, liberal, moral comprehensive doctrines. This is something that neither Rawls nor Haraway considers. So my own view for what should be done is that we will need to establish laws and institutions that rule out the existence of comprehensive doctrines that are unsustainable with our ecosystems. And so the challenge then is to work out how to do that. But at least that's one answer. We know we need to do that. And that's going to rely on liberal freedoms to an extent, because we need illiberal collective commitment by imposing a moral comprehensive doctrine which says we need ecosystem stability. We need to work towards that. We need to try to achieve that. And we need that to be imposed on people, an illiberal view, because that it means imposing a moral comprehensive doctrine on the political. So there you have my creative reflection. You've seen me, and you can do this in your own. You can have the first requirement and your response. The second requirement with its subpoints. What would a liberal political philosopher say? What are some problems with this and what should be done? And have a paragraph under each with the reference identified at the top as I did at the start. I hope that's helpful. I hope you can see now what I'm expecting you to do. So we've now come to the very close of our subject. This lecture has provided you with an overview of what we've achieved. And I'd like to thank you in closing for accompanying me on this exploration of how political philosophy became renewed in the US in response to the social movements, and whether and how commitments to public reasons can help us improve our lives in response to existing and emerging problems. I look forward to reading your creative reflections, and you'll receive your marks for your essays shortly as well. I hope that you enjoyed this subject, and if you could please hop online and complete a subject evaluation for this subject and for my teaching, I'd be very grateful, because this will not only help me to improve the subject, I can also potentially use those responses and your feedback to make a case for continuing to teach this subject in subsequent years. Again, I need to get enough responses for this to make, for the data to be meaningful for us. So please do, I'd be very grateful if you could hop online and provide that anonymous response. I won't get the feedback until you've received your results for the subject, so it's certainly anonymous. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to explore this material with you this semester.